The St. Christopher Medallion by James Turner. I suppose they could be called ghosts of the mind, whatever they may be. But I am not sick in the mind, only overcome with a sorrow I shall never shake off. It is true, perhaps, that, being a writer, I do have a vivid imagination. I do not believe that this makes the slightest difference to the dead boys who are persecuting me. The truth is, they have long ceased to be anything like a figment of the imagination. I know that in death they still exist. They are almost more real to me now than they were when they were alive. Now, 30 years after I knew them as schoolboys, I understand the horror of what they wanted, though I did not at the time. You grow older, and the events of the day tend to become insignificant compared with events of the past. This is a common enough experience indeed. In this alone I can perhaps be said to be sick, if such nostalgia is a form of sickness. I regard it only as a bad habit, like keeping my diary, a habit which perhaps fosters the past too much, because it is so easy to turn the pages and go back to it. Not that my diary will be of any use to, say, historians of the period. It deals with only everyday matters, like the weather, and how Aunt Kitty is getting on in hospital, and whether, if she dies, I shall come into money. In fact, she did die, and I did inherit. Not that the money was a great deal of use to me, since the one person I loved, almost more than my son Raymond, was my wife, Valerie, and she died of cancer shortly after Aunt Kitty. Naturally, the day in 1969, when I took Raymond to Lancing College for the first time, these two boys appear on the appropriate page of my diary. It was inevitable that with all those boys about in the quads and houses, the first day of summer term, I should be thinking about them, for they were the most dramatic events of my own days at the same school, back in 1931, when I too was 13. The school buildings had not changed much. After I left Raymond with his housemaster, I crossed the upper quad with its war memorial cross, went down the stone steps to the long cloister, past the armory and into the chapel. One is always drawn into this colossal building. It would have been impossible for me not to have gone back into it, since I had not been back into the school for at least 15 years. So much of our daily life at the school was spent within its walls that I assume most boys never forgot the place, with its clear glass windows, its tall arches, Gothic roof, and the wide open space before the high altar. That night I wrote my diary, 2nd of May, Friday, 1969. Took R to L for his first term. I wonder if he felt as I did when I was a new boy here. I wish his mother could have been with us. I suspect that R did too. I don't believe he has yet given up grieving for her since she died. I remember my mother had come with me as far as the college farm, and left me to go up the narrow path, between iron railings on each side of which were fields. I felt alone, lost, deserted. I remember turning and waving to her. Then I reached the first of the college buildings, and she waved back. I was convinced then I would never see her again. Of course I did. I don't think that R felt like that at all. But then I suppose boys are different today. Perhaps only an embarrassment. Perhaps I should not have come with him, but I had a terrible desire to see the old place again and to recapture my old self. Talk about nostalgia. So I went, visiting all the old haunts, like the library, where I had once played the part of an elf in the Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh dear. The dining hall. Breakfast porridge, I remember, has never tasted so good since. And of course the chapel. And I think I knew that in some part of me the two boys would be waiting for me. At all events, being back in the school, I remembered their names clearly enough, Bryant and Hildreth, and how Hildreth had worn round his neck a gold medallion of St. Christopher the last time I saw him. The medallion was very clear in my mind today. The odd thing was that though I had last seen one of them, Bryant, in his coffin before the altar of the Lady Chapel, since I was then a very junior sacristan, today they greeted me as they used to be, dressed in the regulation herringbone school suit. I say greeted, because actually they both raised their hands and waved to me, and then were gone. I felt at first very sad at seeing them now so long in their graves. In fact, Bryant, I seem to remember, is buried beside another boy who was also drowned years ago in the crypt below the chapel floor. If my diaries are printed, I shall of course be accused of hallucinations brought on by returning in an emotional state to the scenes of my youth. I can hear the experts saying could have happened to anyone, since he knew the two boys when he too was a boy, and it made a very lasting impression on him. However that may be, I left the chapel then, and went to walk on the well-kept lawns in front of the hall, with the sun shining on Old Shoreham. Since I did not believe in ghosts, I wanted to think about the two boys and their sudden appearance. I could see no point in my seeing them. I was not in the least frightened, and at that time I felt no danger. I doubt if anyone could have. I rather laughed the whole thing off. After this, there was no reason to stay. I knew none of the present-day masters, or anyone else on the staff who would anyway only be interested in old boys much younger than myself. I got into my car, drove down the long hill to the Sussex Pad Hotel, where my parents had always stayed when they visited me, and along the Coombs Road, up into Steyning, where I had friends who were putting me up. I said nothing to them about the visions of the two boys. Indeed, I would have dismissed the experience altogether as some kind of subjective phenomenon, had it not been for the fact that, shortly after I left Raymond at the school, I moved from London to Cornwall to live with my sister. I had long wanted to be near the sea, she being a lonely spinster and I a widower. Well, we got on well together. I can hardly be believed when I say that those two boys I knew so long ago in my school days moved as well. I began to be frightened for my sanity. I began to think I had done them some injury in the past, for which I was being made to make reparation. Yet I could remember nothing. The fact was that at school I had hardly known them, my only real contact with them being in their deaths and after, at their funerals, or at least at the funeral of one of them, Bryant. Hildreth was buried in London, I suppose the actual point of contact, the spring which set off their arrival in Cornwall at the same time as myself, is the fact that Truro Cathedral closely resembles Lancing College Chapel. At least so it seems to me, though I believe, knowing nothing about architecture, that the chapel is neo-Gothic and the cathedral is a copy of early English. Nevertheless, they do, as buildings internally, resemble each other very nearly. And they were there the first time I went in, on June 22nd, 1969. I went in to get out of the rain, running down Cathedral Lane and straight in at the south door. It was after I had been into the exquisite Lady Chapel, really the old parish of St. Mary's, or what is left of it, that I walked into the north aisle, behind the high altar. And there he was, Hildreth, just as I remembered him. This time I was really taken aback. More, I was angry that he should so persecute me, and there was no mistaking the boy, dressed in his school suit, with his face made up with powder and lipstick. I will come to this aspect of him later. It was the cause of his suicide, and so much else which was to affect me sorely. Nobody but myself was in that part of the cathedral at the time. I stood absolutely still and looked into his eyes. He was smiling at me, but it was not a smile with any joy in it. Oddly, I was not then afraid of him, only angry. If I had not thought that, for some reason I did not know, he wanted something of me, I believe I should have attacked him, even though we were in a sacred place. Of course, it would have made no difference, real as he appeared to be. Within a minute, perhaps, while I waited, and neither of us approached the other, it was as if a barrier separated us, yet I knew who we were both waiting for. The other boy, Bryant, joined him. This appearance was quite horrible. He emerged, that is the only word, from a low door in the cathedral wall, probably from a room used by vergers. I think I cried out something like, "Oh no, not like that." You see, he was, for one thing, naked, which seemed to me to be an affront to the holiness of the building. He was covered in mud and green slime. Water was falling from his body onto the stone floor. He was crying and holding out his hands, not to me but to Hildreth, pleading with him. I was convinced, then, that I was being shown a picture of something which was intended to have great meaning for me. I remembered, of course, that Bryant had died of drowning in the river Adur, and must have looked like this when he was found on the river bank, some way from where he entered the water. The very odd thing was that the St. Christopher medallion I had once seen round Hildreth's neck was now round Bryant's neck. There was really no mistaking this fact. I don't know whether Bryant actually said the words, only that I was conscious of his saying them. I am sure his lips moved, and I recall the whisper, "Don't let him, don't let him." Before I could move, Hildreth had crossed to him, had taken Bryant in his arms, as if he wished to stifle the words. All the time he was smiling at me with that weird and frightening smile. Then people began shuffling into the aisle, whispering and looking about them as they do. The vision, if it were that, and not something more sinister, faded. I seemed to hear a faint cry, a pleading from Bryant, and they were gone. When I left the cathedral, the rain stopped. The sun was shining. I went to a cafe and had tea. I was confused and not a little alarmed that the boys, so long dead, had followed me to Cornwall. This time I was sure that my seeing them was no subjective phenomenon. I was not in an emotional state at all. I was very happy. I was not even thinking of them, though, as I have said, I was thinking of the resemblance of the cathedral to Lancing Chapel. And now, of course, every time I go into Truro, I am drawn to the cathedral. Every time, when the north aisle is empty, they come. I may grow older, but they never do. They never say anything, but I am conscious of Bryant's pleadings and the wickedness of Hildreth's smile. There is something I can do. This is what I perceive to be their message. What? I thought of lighting candles to their shades, of having masses said for their souls, if that was possible, but to no avail. It was eventually perfectly clear to me that they were begging for release, begging me, who, as I have said, hardly knew them at all, to release them. But from what? And how? Finally, in desperation at seeing them so often, I decided the only thing I could do was to write their stories, insofar as I knew them. Could this be that, as I was a writer, and could make their situations clear, what they needed? Did they want to be justified in some way? I could hardly believe it. Yet it was all I could think of to do for them. If I did write about them as they were in 1931, if I published their pathetic, almost juvenile life stories, it might, in some way I could not comprehend, satisfy them. It might do more. It might release me from their attentions. How wrong I was. It shows how the living can little understand the dead, that I was so crass as to make myself believe that this was what they, or at least Hildreth, wanted. I know now, of course, that it was the very last thing he wanted, the very last. The first boy, Hildreth, the one who had not drowned, was not a friend of mine at all, but like everybody else in the school, I knew about him. I saw him only once to speak to, standing in the little courtyard outside my house, Fields. He was small, delicate, and obviously waiting for a friend, since boys from the other houses were not allowed to go into a friend's house without permission. One had to get a resident to go back and find whoever it was one wanted. I knew him then only by reputation. A new boy in Sanderson's house, a very odd new boy, so clever that he had gone straight into the classical sixth. Such a rare event alone had singled him out. The other rumours were, I thought then, merely malicious jealousy, gossip. Anything might be said about a boy who didn't attach any importance to games. You see, we were so tightly bound into the society of our own houses that it would have been difficult in any case to discover the truth, even if I had wanted to. It was said that he put on lipstick, manicured his nails and painted them, and was very careful of his hair before he went to bed. Such a thing was worse than saying his prayers, or rather declaring that he believed in what he did when, each night, he knelt beside his bed, as we all did, to pray to order. The prefect would enter the dorms when we were washed, and in our pyjamas, and bellow out the ridiculous command, "Say your prayers," exactly as if we were on parade and being told to stand to attention. So this Sunday, Hildreth was standing under the arches of the cloister in the upper quad, his slight figure in front of the room in which we kept our tuck-boxes. Behind him was the master's tower, rising beyond his fair head, and the tunnel leading to the 5 courts, and the green brass of the quadrangle set about the war memorial. Now the odd thing was that he didn't look afraid, or cowed in any way. I might almost describe his attitude as brazen. I had heard of dreadful things being done to him at night in the dormitories of Sanderson's house, of beatings and other forms of torture. But now, when he asked me to go and tell his friend Bryant that he was waiting for him, he did not look afraid, only confident, intelligent, and, though he was younger than myself, much older than his age, it struck me that, in fact, he was much older, in experience anyway, even than the head boy. I did not feel I was talking to a boy at all. His face was flushed. I saw that it wasn't a natural flush, but something like rouge. Perhaps the rumours were true. His lips also were unnaturally red, and his hair beautifully waved. He used his hands in an expressive way, his fingers long and tapering, soft. He was no taller than any other boy of his age. Indeed, his round face, the light blue eyes, and his painted features reminded me of a girl, and it was, of course, the exact effect he was after. It was incredible that he had the courage to get himself up so, and to be standing there, outside Field's house, waiting for his friend Bryant to go for a walk with him over the downs. It was obvious that whatever suffering he had been made to undergo, he was taking no notice of it. It had not changed any of his habits. Or so I thought. I was completely wrong in this. He may have looked happy, arrogant, serene. In fact, he was at the end of his tether. Perhaps in some way we other boys did not understand. He welcomed the suffering. He must have known the effect of his femininity on the baboons, with whom his crass parents were causing him to live, like a missionary amongst savages. Was it possible that, corrupted himself, he wanted to corrupt others? In the regulation school suit, he looked slightly ridiculous, a puppet, a doll, who was going to have an unmentionable fate, cheerfully and inevitably. I was never to see him alive again. It was difficult to believe that he had existed at all. I could have understood it if, when I saw and spoke to him that afternoon, he had been in tears, or had appealed to me for help. But he did not. It is true, of course, that it wasn't me he wanted, that, at that moment, he was about to escape from his torturers for an hour with a friend, walking in Lancing Ring, a landmark of beech trees. But he showed no sign of what he was planning to do, of what must have been in his mind. If he had said, "I can't stand this any longer, I'm going to kill myself," I suppose I might have believed him, since I knew in a much milder way the horror of other boys. If he had said, "Come out with me, I'm lonely and homesick," I would have gone with him, because I would have known exactly what he meant. But he did not. He only stood there, smiling his superior smile, dressed to kill, waiting, his red, wet lips and his pink cheeks an affront to the system in which he was being forced to exist. I remember particularly that he was wearing a thin gold chain about his neck, on which hung a medallion, a rather large medallion of St. Christopher helping the infant Christ across the river. In fact, I could not help noticing it, since he was gently waving it about in his fingers, rather as if he were trying to mesmerize me. 2 days later we read in the papers that he had committed suicide. They made quite a feature of the gold medallion he was wearing. There was a picture of it. Apparently it was very valuable and very old. The afternoon I spoke to him was a Sunday. We had to go for walks anyway, since we were forbidden to be inside our houses during the afternoon, if it were fine. Fine in this context meant not actually pouring with rain, hail, or snow. It was thought good for boys to walk in gentle rain. So his friend came. I was surprised to see that Bryant, already beginning to be known a little as an athlete, was going out, as we used to call it, with Hildreth. I watched them go off together, arm in arm, which anyway was against the rules for first-year boys, up the long flight of concrete steps leading to the labs, and to the avenue of trees, past the San. Was it then, with the smell of chemicals coming from the labs, that Hildreth formed his idea of suicide? No one can tell. What he and Bryant may have done together in such secret places in the trees of Lancing Ring, I did not care to think about. What he and Bryant may have done together in such secret places in the trees of Lancing Ring, I dare not think about. Perhaps they had quarrelled. Whatever it was, had not been enough to turn him from his purpose. He came back to college on that Sunday afternoon, back to the sneers and the tortures. On Monday, he went to the labs, asked the lab assistant, Mr. Dixon, to mix him up a killing bottle, as he wanted to start a moth collection. It was late September, brilliant and fine, and it was a reasonable request. Dixon found nothing odd in it, and it meant a few shillings in his pocket. He had done the same for any number of boys with the same ambition. He handed the bottle over, with its large, flat cork at the top, and half an inch of lethal potassium cyanide at the bottom, and thought no more about it. So the bright boy took it, and applied for an exeat to go on a visit to his mother in Wimbledon. He said she was very ill. No inquiries beyond the forged letter he showed his housemaster were made as to whether his mother really was ill or not, though later it was reported in the papers that she was in the south of France. The same afternoon, as the train took him up from Shoreham by sea to London, he went out to the common with the killing bottle. He knew exactly what he was going to do. In a few seconds, he thought, he would be released from the nightmare figures of those other boys in Sanderson's house. Openly, he went into a clump of bushes, broke the glass jar, and in what fit of madness or despair, he ate the contents. He was found the next day by a keeper or gardener, and it was obvious that he had suffered considerably. He had not died as quickly as he had hoped. So the boy, who was so much in advance of us all in intelligence, lay in the rictus of death by poisoning, under the blackberry bushes. He who found few difficulties in Homer or Virgil had easily planned his own distraction. He made an electric impression on the school for the first few weeks he was there, and his death made everyone gasp for 5 minutes, and then he was forgotten. His sad ending was not allowed to make the slightest dent in school routine. But for me, for the rest of the term, he was still standing under the cloister arches as the clock in the upper quad struck 3, still wearing the St. Christopher medallion and working it about in his fingers. I was glad he had it with him when he died. I could not bear to think of his despair and loneliness beneath the bushes on Wimbledon Common, his slender fingers breaking the glass jar, his painted mouth devouring the pink cyanide, and his body writhing in that last fearful pain. And then, For years I forgot him, until the day in 1969 when I met him again, the day I took Raymond down to Lansing for his first term. The other boy was Bryant himself. He died of drowning in the same term as Hildreth killed himself. Only a few weeks later, no one in the school, as far as I know, connected the two deaths. He died, so it seemed, by his own carelessness. At least, that was the coroner's opinion. But now I am full of doubt. I think that his death was far from accidental. Back in the summer term, we had all taken the river swimming test. Once you had swum up and down the indoor bath half a dozen times, you were given permission to take the stiffer test of a crossing of the river and back. So one afternoon we went with the master across the playing fields under the wire into the small wood nicknamed Gethsemane, to the river's bank. 12 of us, guarded each side by older and stronger boys, entered the cold water and swam across directly into the swift current under the shadow of the cement works at Bamba. We were told only to use the breaststroke and to swim upriver, the current being strong enough to help us land in the right spot. On no account were we to swim directly to the pole opposite, marking where we were to land, or we should be driven downstream and end up under the wooden toll bridge near Shoreham. So we swam in a batch, reached the slippery bank on the other side, and returned in triumph and safety. Once the test was over, we went back over the Coombs Road and the fields. Our bodies were tingling from the cold river and the rough toweling, shouting with pleasure at the larks overhead, at other boys playing cricket. Later, at supper, a master slipped you a piece of green cardboard with your name on it, and the printed information that you were now considered to be a competent swimmer. Both I and Bryant were, therefore, qualified. After the summer holidays, in the middle of October, as I've said, Bryant went back to the river alone. I can imagine him slipping away to the attraction of the water. At least, that is how we all saw what happened in 1931. But I believe now there was a more subtle reason for his being by the river, an irresistible calling, making him go into the water, a suggestion that, this way, he could drown his sorrow at the loss of his friend Hildreth. So he came to the river, forgetting the speed of the current, and that the water would be much colder than in summer. He pulled off his clothes and went in. He must have been at once swept down the deep stream. But he was a strong enough swimmer for one crossing, and no doubt he did that. Once across, though, he had to get back. There was no other way but through the water. Even with a rest in the reeds, which must have been cold, and so reduced his strength still more, he was not strong enough for the return swim. The current overcame him halfway, swept him downriver toward the sea. He was found that evening, much nearer the old wooden toll bridge, naked on the mud banks. He was quite dead, his body blue, stiff, cold. 2 nights later I was required, being a junior sacristan, to receive his body in its coffin, to spend the night on trestles before the altar in the Lady Chapel. He was to be buried in the crypt the next day. The main chapel doors were not opened. The undertakers brought in the light wood coffin at a small door near the flight of stairs leading to the organ loft. I stood with the head sacristan, a boy named Marsh, to receive and accompany the coffin inwards. The procession of the coffin was done with unseeming haste, its shadow large on the walls under gaslight, vivid, macabre. When the coffin was in place, one of the undertakers opened the lid to see that everything inside was in order. I stood there and looked down at the face of Bryant, serene and quiet. I noticed that the St. Christopher medallion, which I had last seen round Hildreth's neck the day I called Bryant out to him for their walk, now lay in the folded hands of the corpse. It was not possible. It had been round Hildreth's neck. It had been round Hildreth's neck still when he was found dead on Wimbledon Common. It had presumably been buried with him. The papers, as I've said, published a very clear picture of it and discussed its value. I would certainly have known it anywhere. At the time, there in the emotional atmosphere of the chapel, the coffin and Bryant's corpse, I explained it to myself by saying that Hildreth's parents must have given it to Bryant, knowing of the deep attachment he had for their son. Any other explanation for me at that time would have been unthinkable. But now I know why Bryant was swimming in the river. And it is not knowledge that I am proud of possessing. Hildreth, I am convinced, had a power after death much greater than any he had had in life. Such power might well explain why he seemed to be indifferent to the bullying he received in the few weeks he spent at the school. The undertaker's man, smelling of fish and chips and cigarette smoke, said nothing when he closed the coffin and screwed it down. Another laid a wreath of chrysanthemums from the boy's parents on top of the coffin and went away. Marsh was already putting out the gas lights with a long, slotted pole. I stood for a moment, touching the coffin with my fingers, trying to solve the puzzle of the medallion. I wondered, suddenly, whether his adventure had been worth it. To be lost in the cold weeds of the river. I wondered at the fright which must have numbed his limbs before he succumbed to death, and I wondered, still more, with revulsion, at the thought of his cold, naked body in the mud. I brushed the tears from my eyes and came down the altar steps and into the ante-chapel. When I got to the door, I turned back to look. The river with its weeds going down into autumn, the seabirds coming upstream, were they the last things he saw? The muddy taste of the salt, fishy water, the last thing he tasted? I was not sure. I closed the chapel door and went out into the main courtyard before the hall. Night had fallen. The entire college was twinkling with lights. The shadow of the great chapel was swinging into Orion, and the plough, and the boy who tried to conquer the river was now alone forever. Now, in 1969, I knew what I did not then know, that he was not alone at all. Was it conceit that made me write out their stories, or only the nostalgia of returning to the college? It is true, I began to understand them a little more, to understand how a boy like Bryant could be attracted to a boy like Hildreth, because we were shut up so closely, and for so long each term. Besides, I am myself so much older now, and can understand certain things better. I think I know now why Bryant drowned, and who it was he went naked into the river to meet. He must have seen Hildreth on the far bank, calling to him, and he had gone to him, even if he knew that Hildreth was dead, and it was what we call a ghost. And no doubt it was then that he received the St. Christopher medallion. I think now, after the tragedy which overcame me, that I should have considered more carefully what the visions in the cathedral actually meant. I should not have been swept away by the idea of writing about the boys. I should have regarded their appearance in Cornwall as a warning. I should have seen the evil of Hildreth and warned the headmaster. Yet I knew nothing then to be warned about, and should have looked a fool if I had written to the headmaster and explained my fears, got him to put the riverbank out of bounds. And perhaps even then it would not have made any difference to what happened. And it was not until the telephone rang one Thursday evening at the end of June, 1969, that I knew where the danger lay. By then, it was too late. It was the headmaster himself. He told me that my son, Raymond, had met with an accident while swimming, and that I must come immediately. I drove all night up the A30. It was still dark when I arrived at the Sussex Pad Hotel. I did not knock them up, for I had no intention of sleeping. I walked along the Coombs Road, praying in a naive sort of way that Raymond was all right. I now had an intense fear of Hildreth and what he could do. I looked up at the chapel as dawn opened the sky and struck the long windows. Light began to pour into the valley. I got as far as Gethsemane before I turned back. The headmaster was waiting for me, and in his study he broke the news to me. I knew it already. Raymond had died in the night. Everything had been done for him, but with the length of exposure after the cold of the river, he never regained consciousness. It was, of course, the saddest moment in my life. "Where is he now?" I asked. "In the Brighton hospital, where he was taken last evening," the headmaster said. "It was best that he be taken there, as we do not have the necessary equipment here in the sanatorium. I am assured that the doctors did everything they could." Well, I went back to the Sussex Pad, drank black coffee to overcome the exhaustion of the night before and the appalling news. I was stunned. Later I drove into Brighton. I asked to see Raymond. He was lying very still on a slab in the mortuary. I pulled down the sheet and looked at his young face, at the face I loved so much. He looked extraordinarily like his mother when I had first known and courted her. Round his neck was the gold chain, and hanging from it was the St. Christopher medallion. I had last seen it round the neck of the ghost of Bryant in the cathedral in Cornwall. Now, finally, I knew what had happened to Raymond, and who had called him to his death in the river, as the boy Bryant had been called. Once more, 30 years later, Hildreth had got hold of a victim. Or was it Bryant, acting under Hildreth's orders? After Raymond's death and funeral, he was buried like Bryant in the chapel crypt. I seemed no longer interested in anything. My purpose in living was dead. My sister did her best to awaken my spirits, but she did not have much success. It must have been late in August when I went into the cathedral again. They were there, of course. I suppose I expected them, and that was why I went. They were standing, Bryant and Hildreth, in the same spot when I had first seen them. I noticed at once that neither of them was wearing the gold medallion. Yet they looked happy, almost ecstatic, as they turned to the low door behind them. I knew quite well what was going to happen when the door opened. Or did it open? I'm not sure. All I do know is that Raymond was suddenly there between them, and the three of them were holding out their hands to me. I noticed, as their figures began to fade, that it was now Raymond who was wearing the medallion. But it was only later that the full horror of Raymond's death struck me. Which schoolboy would be the next to be called by Hildreth and Bryant, and by Raymond? To whom would Raymond pass on the St. Christopher medallion?